Thank you, everyone, for showing up to today's Competitive Enterprise Book Forum. I'm Ryan Young, Senior Economist here at CEI, and while I do see some familiar faces here, I also see some new faces here, and that is always a delight. So if any of you don't know what CEI is all about, we are a think tank headquartered here in Washington, and we focus on issues such as regulation, economic freedom, and personal freedom. And it is a delight to welcome our author today, Shanker Singham, who has written the book, International Trade, Regulation, and the Global Economy, The Impact of Anti-Competitive Market Distortions. Shanker is a distinguished economist and a lawyer, an expert on trade and competition policy, or antitrust as we call it here in the US. He is the CEO of Competier, chairman of the Growth Commission, and an advisor to governments and industry. You also, according to your bio, helped to privatize electricity in the UK. I'm actually curious about that. What was your role in that?
Oh, God. That's one of the first things that we did. We represented, my law firm at the time represented the National Grid Company, which, so the UK's electricity privatisation was, the Chileans were first actually, but the UK was second. It was the Thatcher-era privatisations of electricity and rail and lots of different water and so forth. All the big utilities that had been in government ownership. I wrote another book actually about the market distortions in privatisation processes around the world. We made a number of mistakes in the. You'll see that I've made a lot of mistakes in the last 35 years. But one of the mistakes we made in the privatisation of the electricity industry in the UK was it was a competition issue. We did not pay enough attention to competition, so we created a duopoly in generation, a single monopolist transmission distribution company and regional electricity companies that did not actually compete with each other, obviously, because it's electricity being what it is. So we had to retool and deal with the lack of competition. And actually, we're still, that was early 90s, and we're still dealing with the effects of this in terms of the grid in the UK is. As you would expect a monopolist to do, best monopoly profit is a quiet life, and they had a very quiet life and didn't upgrade the grid. So the grid is in big trouble in the UK, and that's one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, the bigger reason are environmental policies and taxes and so forth, but it's one of the reasons that the energy cost in the UK is, I think, 4 times the energy cost of the US. Most of that is net zero and environmental regulation, but there's a contributory factor of the lack of competition at the grid level. But we did that in the early 90s, and then because of that, when the former Soviet Union, when Berlin Wall came down, and so a lot of these countries then needed privatizations and moving into the market economy. So I did work in most of the Central and Eastern European countries. We wrote privatization laws in Lithuania and Latvia, and competition laws in Hungary and Poland. And ironically, because recently I've been helping the UK government negotiate their way out of the EU. We actually wrote the Europe agreements for Hungary and Poland when they were coming into the EU. It's very. The first stage of accession is called the Europe Agreement, and then you have all the accession process. It takes about 10 years to do all this. But we did the initial ones for Hungary and Poland. And one thing that we did get right to some extent was if you look at Europe now, the fastest growing bit of Europe, of the EU, are the Central Eastern European countries and the Baltics. Western Europe growth rates are appalling, but the bright spot is Central Eastern Europe and the Baltics, and a lot of that I think is because they have an institutional memory of what the other looks like, and they remember and they recognise when people are suggesting regulations that are anti-competitive, barriers, protectionism, etc., they sort of recognise what that looks like. And they've done, to the extent you can in the EU, they have resisted a lot of that.
Well, I will say that you are not the only person in the room who has experience in privatization in the UK. Our own Ian Murray used to work in the transport ministry, if I recall correctly, played a role in that. But your work in Central and Eastern Europe is especially instructive because privatization can go one of two ways. It can go that successful way, or it can go the way of Russia, which is not at all competitive and not at all on the level. And that led Milton Friedman to say that one of his greatest mistakes, besides coming up with income tax withholding, was his advice in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when he said the first three things they need to do are privatize, privatize, and privatize. After the experience of the rise of the oligarchs and how politicized and how cronyist Russia became, he later said that he made a mistake. And if he were able to do that one over, he would say, privatize, 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 provided that you have the rule of law.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a theme running throughout your book.
Yeah, I mean, I would add a couple of things to that, actually. I mean, I think we did work in Russia as well. And I think the problem with the Central and Eastern European and the former Soviet transitions was we all made the same mistake. You know, we all assumed that if you open up at the border, if you open up trade at the border, that competition will automatically follow, that economic democracy will automatically follow that, and political democracy will automatically follow that, and all the things that come from our vision of economic democracy, agency, all of these things will follow. None of it followed. We didn't even get to competition, never mind all the other things. So the mistake was not putting enough attention on how markets actually function inside the newly opened, the newly privatized industries. And so essentially what we did is the gains of trade were pocketed by the gatekeepers of the economy, the oligarchs and so forth, and we strengthened the oligarchs. We didn't understand the power of the status quo in the incumbent forces in those countries, and just generally in countries everywhere. And by that misunderstanding allowed this to happen. And, you know, I went from Central and Eastern Europe to Latin America in September 92, and we did a lot of the opening and market opening in Latin America. Same thing happened. Again, this really focused my attention on the importance of competition policy and consumer welfare enhancement in your overall trade and economic policy architecture. I mean, part of the problem, you know, we had is, and we still have it to some extent, is, and I'm delighted to see my co-author of a previous book, Alden Abbott, over there, but I think he is an exception to this general rule that we very much silo the domains. So the trade people don't speak to the competition people don't speak to the regulatory people. This makes no sense at all. And that's part of the reason, you know, we developed this economic model that focuses on three things, which is, you know, how open is your trading system, how competitive, or best way to describe it is how well does your domestic regulatory system deliver competition on the merits, and how well do you protect property rights, including all property rights, including intellectual property rights. And those three things are, under our model, directly correlatable to GDP per capita.
Well, and in a big way. If I remember, the number that you said is
the numbers
that,
are big.
You know, one of the biggest questions in economics and in life is, why are some countries rich and other countries poor? Your model says that those three things are responsible for as much as 90% of the per capita GDP variance in countries around the world.
Yeah. And what's interesting is they don't all operate the same way. So let's imagine a developed country like the United States. If you have a 15% improvement, roughly 15% improvement in all of those three pillars, according to our modeling, and we've got various iterations. This model has gone through, I think, at least 5 or 6 different iterations and improvements and refinements, and we are actually now developing a probabilistic model that we can talk about later on. But what we're seeing generally is that a 15% improvement in those 3 pillars leads to, if it's trade, somewhere between 4 and 6% GDP per capita increase. This is a state-to-state model, okay, so it depends on how long it takes to do this. I'm not saying it's going to immediately happen, but over the time it takes to do the things that give you a 15% improvement, you'll get a 4 to 6% GDP per capita gain from your trade, the trade pillar. The competition pillar, the domestic regulatory pillar in terms of how well does regulation deliver competition, is between 8 and 11%. And property rights are somewhere in between, 7.5%. So what this is telling us is that if you go back to that Central Eastern European example in Latin America and all the opening stuff, what it's telling us is that we prioritized something that moved the needle 25, 30%, and we ignored 70 to 80%. And that was the wrong way around. What we should have done is really focused on the big mover, which was domestic regulation and competition in domestic regulation. So one of the insights of the model is that the different effects these things have, and the size of these things, that these are big numbers. We did a little experiment, academic experiment in the book. We imagined that I didn't make all the mistakes that I've made over the last 35 years, and we imagined that we got it all right. And we looked at, from 1990 to 2016, we imagined, we basically optimized every country in the world to perfect, pillar score, and looked at, well, what would that have done? And we found that if you plot what happened and what could have happened, the difference is about $40,000 GDP per capita, which is trillions of dollars. So the idea that we're kind of at the edge of the frontier, that we've really exhausted all the innovation gains and so on, is absurd. It's always been absurd. I just remember 1938, the American Keynes, whose name is temporarily gone out of my head, Alvin Hansen. I'm glad you're here. Alvin Hansen said in 1938, we have now exhausted all of the innovation gains. That's kind of done. And we've also exhausted all of the population growth. This man was FDR's chief advisor. So from the time of Malthus, we've always said that we've exhausted all these gains, and we are, on our model, we are nowhere near anywhere near the frontier. We could do a lot more and that's why this is an urgent issue, I think. Because it doesn't have to be this way. We look at very low growth rates in the G7. US has been a bit more resilient, but certainly Western Europe growth rates are basically zero. Have been that level for many couple of decades at least. UK GDP per capita was about the same level as the US in the early 2000s. The UK is now 40% poorer. 40%. Poorer than the state of Mississippi, GDP per capita. Germany is poorer than West Virginia, GDP per capita, right? So people don't realize this. If you don't grow, it's intuitively obvious, if you don't grow your economy for 30 years and everyone else is growing around you, you are going to suffer the consequences. So I think there's a real sense of urgency about getting some of this stuff right going forward. And what we've also seen since the financial crisis is the level of distortions, that DC pillar, the domestic competition, regulatory barriers, regulatory protection, has increased enormously. Thousands of new regulations that are designed to protect incumbents and so forth have been put on the books in that period. And when we look at the top 20 countries in our the G20 basically, and we look at levels of distortion from 2010 to 2023, we find that in all cases, except for one, the level of distortion has increased. And that's the top 20. The only one that hasn't, so I'm talking about countries like Singapore, has gotten worse. From a very high base, but nevertheless not going in the right direction. The UAE is the only country actually that has improved in terms of distortions in that period, which is interesting.
Now, you say this is an urgent problem, and I assume this book is part of that project.
Yeah.
One question I like to ask of every author that we do an event with is, who's your audience? Who do you want to reach with these ideas? Who do you want to convince that growth is an urgent imperative and that your ideas for accelerating growth can help?
That's a very good question. I think what I realised, I'll go back to a case that we did in the mid-90s, which really introduced me to the effect. It introduced me to several things. One, the interaction between trade and competition, and also the power of incumbent companies, which was we were counsel to the U.S. new entrants in the Telmex case in Mexico. Telmex, it's quite a famous case and situation and case study. Telmex had been using its local monopoly to anti-competitively cross-subsidize and damage new entrants in the long-distance market where there was competition. And what I found in that case, which we fought at the WTO Basic Telecoms Agreement level and domestically with the Mexican Competition Agency and so on, was that people didn't understand the damage that Telmex was doing to their own household income. Because basically Telmex's anti-competitive activities caused Mexican consumers to have the worst teledensity rates in the OECD and the highest prices in the OECD. And people didn't put it together. They didn't put the numbers together. So I was very convinced at that point that we have to have a way of showing the economic effects and the numbers in GDP per capita terms, in sort of household income terms, of these kinds of things. So the book kind of, and the theories behind the book sprang from that really. So what we want to do is, if you have the numbers and you're able to arm people with the numbers, then you're able to get people to demand better things of their governments. If people think that these numbers are small, for example, it doesn't really matter what regulation we have, because it's really not going to have a huge impact on my household, my income. They're not going to ask, they're not going to demand these things. So we want to show people how much is at stake.
$40,000 is a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. Well, even just look at the UK-US comparison. You could be 40%, being 40% poorer than our American cousins is a big difference. That's a big difference in your lifestyle, in the quality of life, and all these things. So we want to get people to demand these things from their governments. We want policymakers to understand these things. We also want to talk to the siloed practitioners who are, in their silos, not talking to each other. That you can't, we are all engaged in a common enterprise to grow our economies and to increase GDP per capita. When you do that, it's the poorest of your societies that benefit the most. When you do the opposite, it's the poorest who suffer the most. If I make $1 million and I lose $10,000 or $50,000 of GDP per capita, it's an inconvenience. If I make $20,000, it's a catastrophe. And so we want politicians and policymakers to understand the scale of these numbers, to understand the reality of this, and to work together in this common enterprise to actually do what I think can be done, which is to do the kinds of structural reforms, the regulatory reforms, the trade reforms, and to grow the top line of GDP per capita, grow your economy. And then as long as you're doing all the other things in terms of controlling your the size of your state, the size of your welfare state, your debt, and so forth, there's no reason why human beings can't have a massively improved quality of life. That's in the developed world. In the developing world, the stakes are even higher.
Yeah.
One of the tragedies, I think, is of where we are right now, is if you look at the famous Madison, you've all seen the Madison curve, the GDP of the world from 0 AD to now, and you see this have it in the book, the hockey stick,
That was going to be my next question. It's on page 2 of the book. You open it the right way with that big picture.
I mean, the thing about the Madison curve, I open everything usually with that, because what it shows us is several things. You can even go back before the Madison curve starts. You can go back for like 20,000 years of human history, which is when we have really done stuff. 0.995% of that time has been poverty and war. This period from 1947 to probably 2006 is completely unique in human history. Anything sort of coming close to prosperity and peace is completely unique in human history. You have to work really hard to get it. And we did. We worked really hard after the Second World War. And it came because of, that. So 1900 to 1913, economy increases by a factor of about 2, contracts between 1913 and 1947. 47 to 2006, factor of 7 or 8. So think about that. I mean, it really is. It's just an extraordinary curve. Testament to human achievement, and the achievement was, after the war, figuring out that at least the first of these pillars, the trade pillar, we needed to deal with. And the initial International Trade Organization envisaged by the Havana Charter after the Second World War, it was envisaged that all of these things would be covered. Competition would be covered, investment would be covered, all of these things would be covered. Everything I count as an anti-competitive market distortion will be covered in the ITO. And the Congress in the Truman period basically said, that's US national sovereignty, we're not going to get into these things.
Well, to give people a bit of background, everyone knows the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Most people know that WTO had a predecessor named GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That was part of the post-World War II Reconstruction effort. A lot of people do not know about the ITO that never came to be before the war, and that's what you're talking about.
Exactly. And the GATT, the GATT is a contract, right? It's a general agreement on trade and tariffs. It's a contract between the members to lower tariffs, not because that was determined to be the most important thing, but that was the only thing that they were allowed to work on. So we lost all of the other things, and we ended up lowering tariffs. But even because tariffs were so high, even just that caused massive improvement in the economy. It created the transnational company and transnational supply chain. It was incredibly powerful. And we then go to the 70s, and we have a problem, because in the 70s we have all these free riders on the system. And so we started going the plurilateral route, which is we'll do agreements of the coalitions of the willing that will come together to do further liberalization. And you can't benefit from this if you're not prepared to do the liberalization. So we have the government procurement agreement in the Tokyo round in the 70s. Then we get to the launch of the Uruguay round, which puts the old ITO back together in the form of the World Trade Organization, and does deal with services, and does deal with intellectual property, does deal with a lot of these things. And what we were supposed to do after that, and bear in mind that as this was going on, fall of Berlin Wall in 89, what we talked about, the transitions in the Soviet Union, Latin America, India, all these new countries coming on stream. The old GATT was a handful of Western European and the US, basically. Suddenly you have all these new markets coming on stream. Markets that, I and Milton Friedman and others had failed because we did not understand the importance of competition policy. Coming on stream, thinking that, we'll talk about border issues, but anything inside our borders, that's our national sovereignty, that's our internal affairs, as the Chinese would say now, our internal affairs. We're not going to deal with any of this. This doesn't have a trade effect. Indians were very strongly saying this for a long time. And so we get to the 1997 Singapore round, where we're now supposed to deal with competition, we're supposed to deal with investment and so on. And there's no appetite for this. And it's blocked. This was supposed to happen in 97. In 1999, we were supposed to wrap all this into the Seattle round and conclude a even more comprehensive multilateral agreement. All of this failed. Not because there were people on the streets in Seattle, but because developing countries, the big developing countries like the Indias, the Brazils, South Africa, etc., some of the new entrants in these markets in the WTO system, basically said, we're not going to touch. We're not. They had very powerful, like Mexico Telecom, they had very powerful incumbent forces that would not allow them to reform domestically. And the reform domestically was critical to the trade picture, the demands of particularly US companies, but global companies, was a demand for domestic reform in those countries as much as anything else. And they were not prepared to do it. And so the whole system collapsed. Trade is like riding a bicycle. If you don't keep riding, you fall off. So we haven't been riding the bicycle for 30 years. That is a long time. Bear in mind, the system only really started in 1947. So that's a long period of time not to be riding the bicycle at all. There's no surprise that we're in the mess that we're in now.
Not at all. The heart of your book is competition, and trade is a big part of that. Mm-hmm. But it's not the only aspect of competition. Your key concept related to competition and to reform is what you call ACMDs, anti-competitive market distortions. It's in the subtitle of the book. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's also an idea that you have been working on for about 25 years at least, if not longer. Can you explain what ACMDs are? Tariffs are ACMDs, but it's a broader concept than that. You use it in a very specialized way, and that's key to understanding not just your book, but also your reform agenda.
Yeah. I mean, so having established that, open trade, competition on the merits, property rights protection are, as you say, the major contributor to GDP per capita, anti-competitive distortions are, frankly, anything that gets in the way of that. So it would be a tariff. That would be an anti-competitive market distortion. So would a customs process that doesn't work properly. Especially if it's designed not to work properly. Anti-competitive regulation is clearly a very big subset of anti-competitive market distortions. Failure to protect property, failure to protect investment, failure to protect intellectual property. These are all anti-competitive market distortions in our sort of way of framing the issue. And we came up, we were talking earlier on actually, so we came up with that language of ACMDs largely because language is really important in what we do. And sometimes the sort of those of us who believe in competition and open trade and so forth, sometimes our language is not the language of the rest of the world. So, we all know in this room that protectionism is a bad thing. You go out onto the street and you talk about protection. Protection sounds like a good word. We all know that dumping, can be, provided there is not a cost manipulation going on, can be. Low prices are a good thing. Dumping does not sound like a good thing. And so the language has been against us, and I think that has actually affected the political economy of this. And so I wanted to come up with a word that there could be no doubt was a bad thing. And also to reformulate what we're trying to achieve when we sort of think about economics and its role in improving people's lives, which is basically what does good look like, in all of these countries, in all of these different environments. Good looks like voluntary exchange, willing buyers meeting willing sellers, willing sellers meeting willing buyers to solve human need in voluntary exchange or free exchange without distortions. And anything that gets in the way of that is a distortion. Now, the government does many things that distort the market. Not all of them are anti-competitive. So the competition point is very important, because what we're saying is, we're not saying that every government intervention is bad. We're not saying that every government action is necessarily bad. What we are saying is that where it distorts the ordinary forces of competition, where they damage the competitive process, then they are anti-competitive market distortions. And you'd have to show that that was the case, that they were actually anti-competitive. Because when the ordinary competitive forces are negatively affected in this way. We know that GDP per capita suffers, and we know it suffers a lot. So what we wanted to do was come up with that phrase. So it could be anything. I mean, an anti-competitive market distortion could be a traditional trade barrier, a border measure. It could be a regulation that either, it could be a regulation or an approach that artificially lowers the cost of certain favored firms, so they have better advantages around the world. This is what you see in China with China's state-owned enterprises and so on. It could be the same sort of regulatory barrier that increases the costs of new entrants into that market from other countries. This is one of the problems that occurred in the 90s and 2000s, is particularly US firms, but global firms, were given market access through trade and tariff negotiations, but never had market contestability. So if you look at the new entrants in the telecom space in Mexico, they were given market access, but they had no contestability within the market. And those two things are two sides of the same coin. And I don't think I'm saying anything radically new here, because Adam Smith talked about monopoly being the sole engine of mercantilism. Not an engine, not one way of achieving mercantilism. He said it was the sole engine of mercantilism. So I think he recognized that competition and trade were basically two sides of the same coin. I mean, trade is really just an example of competition. It's competition across borders. That's why the pillar, we call it international competition. We don't even call it trade, actually, for a reason.
One way to view competition is as a spectrum. We have monopoly on one end, and you have a freely competitive market on the other hand. And a government-granted monopoly, such as Adam Smith attacked, those were the only kind at the time. There were no large businesses, so the Crown was the only authority that could grant a monopoly. It's a little different these days. Some companies, companies can be much larger than they used to be, but also they can rise to the top simply by being very, very good at what they do.
Right.
So that kind of monopoly is okay, but we have to keep an eye out for ACMDs, because even good companies can engage in rent-seeking activities and lobby for ACMDs and enjoy that protection. And they might not be a monopoly, but they might be somewhere short of that perfectly competitive ideal that we all want to see.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky point, because what we're talking about here is almost a double sell, which is the idea of competition policy is important, and people should know generally that competition on the merits is a good thing, and we need to drive our regulatory systems towards delivering it. But what do we mean by competition is the next sort of point that has to be discussed. And you said very rightly that every business wants to be a monopolist. If you talk to any small business, they don't want to stay small. They want to grow. They want to take market share, and there is nothing wrong with that. That is the business process. That is what should be our system should encourage. That you don't want companies to pull their competitive punches because they're afraid of government regulation. On the other hand, if you have achieved market power or power over price, and you then do illegal things, you then engage in predatory conduct or whatever, that's a different issue, right? So we've got to be careful about what we mean by competition. And so that when I talk about competition, and I'll just give a little plug also for this previous book so just you can see this economics book is quite short, right? This says a lot about my two professions. The economics book is quite short. The legal book is about 600 pages, right? So this is the one I did with Alden, and that was the legal basis for all of these things, in which we talk a lot about competition policy, and I think if your competition policy is delivering productive efficiency, allocative efficiency, and dynamic efficiency, it's a good competition policy. And just because a competition agency does something does not mean that it's pro-competitive. In fact, if actually you look around the world, almost that's a bit of an exaggeration, a lot of things that are being done by competition agencies around the world are anti-competitive, are interventionist, are damaging to productive efficiency, probably to dynamic efficiency. And also, if you prioritize allocative efficiency over productive and dynamic efficiency, you're going to have problems as well. And you're going to get what we call in antitrust circles type 1 error, which is when I discipline something that is actually pro-competitive, but I claim that it's an anti-competitive practice and I stop it. Because if that thing that I've stopped is innovation enhancing, then I can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. I can never recover that innovation. That's why type 1 error is so dangerous and so damaging. I'd far rather have type 2 error, which is I allow something to happen that's anti-competitive and then can discipline it later, than to have type 1 error. I mean, they're both errors, but type 1 error is particularly damaging. And so this is where many scholars in the field diverge, frankly. I mean, I was just with Philippe Aghion, Nobel Prize winner in economics, with whom I agree with on about 90% of the things. But we do diverge a little bit on what is competition. You know, this question of what is competition aimed at achieving. So, you know, there may well be industries where fewer competitors is pro-competitive, is the norm. I mean, it depends on lots of things. We see this playing out a lot in the tech sector right now. And there's some very, very interesting work being done in that area, and we refer to that actually a lot in the other book.
One question related to that is, how do you tell the difference between legitimate and illegitimate competitive behavior?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll say the tools that we have to determine this are not always fit for purpose. So, you know, if you look at mergers, for example, in the antitrust area, you know, we tend to be very static in our analysis. We look at the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, and if the, you know, Herf's up, then we discipline it, and we say no, we can't. You know, you lock the merger or whatever. There needs to be a genuine damage. You need to be able to show a genuine damage to productive, allocative, dynamic efficiency from whatever is the conduct you're talking about. But I would also say that you know, one of the things you mentioned at the beginning, you know, we call in the US, we call what everyone else in the world calls competition policy, we call antitrust, and that's a big issue because it tends to force people to think of antitrust or think of competition policy as all about companies and private behavior and disciplining private behavior. Tim Muris has talked about this. The reality is the private behavior is only one little bit of your overall how your market works. It's government regulation that is anti-competitive is a far bigger area of damage, and there are people who would argue, you know, that's where the focus of competition agencies needs to be. The Australians just did a study of their competition policy writ large, private enforcement and government regulation and productivity, their productivity commission, and found that I think something like 1.8% of GDP growth in Australia in the last 20 years or so attributable to good competition policy. But that was mostly on improvement of the domestic regulatory system. And actually the antitrust, what we would call antitrust, had very little effect. Antitrust enforcement had very little effect.
That's an argument we've been making for a while.
Yeah, well, Australia is a great example. I mean, they've done some very good work on it.
Yeah. One of the numbers that popped out to me from your book isn't just about antitrust policy, about regulations writ large. In the US, just federal regulations, not counting state or local rules, account for a built-in 30% market share advantage for incumbent firms because they raise the barriers to entry so high. How can we address that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a great study done by Shiv Singla of Goethe University. It's a machine learning study of the federal rule book, and found that 31 to 37% of market share increases were attributable to federal rules, not to competition, not to ordinary business activity, but to federal rules. So we know this intuitively, that companies always want to stop competition from new entrants. You know, incumbents typically do want to stop this, and if they can't do it through their own business acumen, they're going to do it through lobbying, and there is a very high cost of lobbying. And as you said, that's just the federal rule book. State and local is in some ways even more extreme. Now, one of the advantages we have is that there is actually now an executive order on anti-competitive regulation, and the DOJ and the FTC are supposed to be leading the charge on eliminating anti-competitive regulation in the US, which is, there's plenty of it, and that is a real opportunity because we haven't, the OECD and organizations like the International Competition Network have been saying for years, this is how you regulate. This is how you should regulate. You think about the effect of your regulatory proposal on competition, the OECD competition assessment and regulatory toolkit, and you evaluate what that cost is before you regulate. They've been saying this. No country really does this. I think the US executive order is probably the first time there's even been a real attempt to say that we are going to look at regulation from a competition standpoint. So the problem with a lot of regulatory reform ideas and deregulation, it becomes about 1 in, 10 out, 1 in, 5 out. I mean, shorten the size of the federal rule book. I mean, this is not the problem. The problem is, what is the effect of your regulation on competition? And that's what we should be dealing with. Whenever you have a system of 1 in, X out, or whatever it happens to be, you can imagine what bureaucrats will do. They'll look for the easy things to get rid of. The other problem we have with regulatory reform is it's all about business compliance cost, and and even the language. It's burdensome regulation. We want to lift the burden off our businesses. These are all good things. I'm not saying we want to burden businesses, but that's not the problem. The problem is the anti-competitive effect. The damage from burdensome regulation, i.e. the compliance cost of regulation, is a fraction of the anti-competitive effect cost of regulation. That's where the focus should be. That's why ICN and OECD have said this, for some time.
Well, I would argue that reformers' focus shouldn't even be so much on getting rid of this or that individual ACMD, although we do need to do that. There is, one of our policy mantras at CEI is that institutions matter. We have to look at the structures and the processes that keep generating ACMD after ACMD every year, forever. It's not enough just to get rid of this or that rule. We have to treat those institutions. Are there any of those structural processes-oriented reforms that you might suggest?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think we need to do is to drive competition thinking into sectoral regulators. Because they don't think in terms of competition. Never mind what vision of competition you have. I mean, they don't even think about competition at all, really. I'll give you one example from the telecom case that we did in Mexico. We went in, I was a naive young lawyer, and we went in and we were complaining to the competition agency in Mexico about the activities, the anti-competitive activities, not necessarily of Telmex, but of the regulatory system and the COFETEL, the telecom regulator, what the regulatory plan they were putting together, which had been lobbied for by Telmex. And we went in complaining, and you know what they said? They said, we have to be careful how we regulate Telmex because it's the #1 stock on the Mexican stock exchange. That was the antitrust agency. So there are many other things they think about. And what we need to do is infuse competition thinking into all regulators. And one of the things the Australians successfully did with their Productivity Commission is exactly that. They did succeed in getting competition thinking into regulators as a sort of block on regulatory capture and a way of dealing with regulatory capture. I mean, we have a lot of distortions that we have to deal with. But there is a fundamental distortion that we have to deal with, which is, without becoming too theological about it, which is the how we measure these things. So in our vision, when we talk about a reduction of ACMDs and distortions, we're talking about wealth creation. We want to create wealth in the economy, and it's non-zero sum, and you can create it out of nothing, and we all know this. Wealth is very hard to create, very easy to destroy. But what we don't ask often is, what is wealth? Wealth is the realization of ideas. It's how quickly you go from idea generation to idea crystallization. Money is just a measurement, or it should be. This is the problem that we have, is we have unmoored the measurement device from any concept of value. So we have a fundamental distortion in the heart of all of this, and it's going to be tough to deal with that. And so we have to deal with, what we can deal with, but we can't ignore at the same time that there is this fundamental fiscal distortion in the heart of the market that we have.
That is a fundamental problem. GDP is measured in money, but it's not actually about dollars or pounds or euros. Right. It's about dignity. It's about ideas.
Exactly.
Go back to that chart that you put on page 2 of your book. Flat for thousands of years, and then all of a sudden around 1800 or so there's that wealth explosion. That's where we get lower infant mortality rates, vaccines, better health care, modern sanitation, longer life expectancies. People grow inches taller just from having better nutrition as children. They have more opportunities, more dignity. That, not dollars, is what GDP is about.
Should be, and what we need to do is give, what all of that does, what the top of that Madison curve does, is it gives people agency. They feel like they wake up in the morning and they can make a difference, in their world, and that's the sort of name of the game. It's human thriving and prosperity, these sorts of things.
But what gets measured gets managed.
Yes, and the problem, GDP per capita is an imperfect tool. It's the best we have probably, but there are problems associated with it. It does include government spending as well as consumer spending. It does have this, imports over exports, exports over imports sort of constituent element in it, which doesn't always make sense. Which we're seeing now, because, I think a lot of the deregulatory agenda in the UK, in the US, and some of the other things are contributing to these growth numbers in the US that are quite good. But again, if your GDP per capita or your GDP includes, exports minus imports, and your imports have gone down because you've done something, it's not really an indication of success in the way that we might think it is. How much that is, we don't know, but so there are flaws in the metrics that we're using. But one of the things about the model, though, is it's a percentage increase. So we're not, we're just talking about all things being equal. You eliminate these distortions, you get this percentage uplift. And actually, the model that we also are starting to develop, one of the problems we have in classical economics is all economic models, for the most part, are deterministic models. Even the most dynamic stochastic models are deterministic models. But the world is not deterministic, the world is probabilistic. So we are developing a probabilistic economic model which uses the outputs of the econometric model, the IC, the international competition, domestic competition, property rights, pillar scores, as a way of looking at how you come to understand the probability and the intensity of voluntary exchange. And when you do it that way, what we're proxying is much closer to actual wealth creation in the way that you described it, as opposed to just sort of pure, GDP per capita sort of, manipulation, as it were. So I'm quite excited about the probabilistic model, because the numbers we're getting are quite interesting. Because it's probabilistic, without getting too much into the technicality of it, well, I'm happy to if people ask. Because it's probabilistic, because it's based on a wave function, because it therefore involves a second differential, we think it much better captures dynamic effects of voluntary exchange, which I think most economic models don't really capture. If you think about your supply and demand curves and your market equilibrium and your deadweight losses, the problem that we have is that the Harburger triangles are too small. That these deadweight losses are they're not really, if I damage my economy with an anti-competitive regulation, my problem is not the deadweight loss as measured by a classical economic model. My problem is the dynamic loss, which is far, far bigger. And so there have been various attempts to sort of, change the shape of the triangle to make it bigger, but it's not ever going to be anywhere near what is actually happening. I think that this probabilistic model actually gets closer to that, and that the numbers we're seeing, suggest that.
Your book is filled with scientific analogies, and the inner Hayekian in me had some alarm bells go off about the difference between science versus scientism. But at the same time, it had some amazing insights I hadn't thought of before. For example, typical blackboard economics models assume perfection. You said that they're deterministic. Yeah. That's because the species in those economic models is not Homo sapiens, it's Homo economicus.
Yes, right. Yeah.
There's some equilibrium point in the market, and Homo economicus just automatically buys and sells and exchanges to reach that point.
Right.
They're not making decisions. They're not acting like human beings. One thing you point out is bringing in the concept of entropy. People make decisions. There are transaction costs. There are economic frictions. And while people will always chase after that equilibrium point, even as it moves from here to here, and they might not even know which direction it's moving at a given time, there is always that tendency to move there. But doing so always comes at a cost. And the closer you get to that ideal equilibrium point, the greater the cost, the greater the entropy, the term that you bring in from physics, to achieve that. That's an amazing insight.
Yeah, I mean, just to your earlier point about Hayek, I think we've got to be, I spend a lot of my time working on these kind of models and so on, but I think, we tend to fetishize economic models. They don't predict things super accurately, and we shouldn't be trying to come up with, for the reasons that you mentioned, human beings are human beings, they're not automata. But having said that, I think there are certain things that models can do that are very valuable. One is demonstrate orders of magnitude. And I think this model, particularly the different orders of magnitude for the different elements, with the trade opening, the competition, probably, that's a real insight. I think sign, that's a pretty important intuition from an economic model that is valuable. I think using the same model to look at the same issue, or to look at different regulatory programs, as it were, and seeing what the model is saying about those different programs is useful. But we have a tendency to sort of assume that they can predict the future, and they cannot do that. But they can tell us a lot about how we came to be where we are and what we should be doing. That's likely, all things being equal, to give us a better outcome. I think science is useful in the sense of formalism. I have a scientific background. I did do a master's in quantum mechanics, so it's not an entirely alien thing to me. But I'm the first to say it's only the formalism that is useful. It's a way of thinking about interactions that is very rigorous, and there are intuitions that we can derive from those things. But we're not suggesting that the world is quantum.
I think one thing that a lot of economists forget is that it is better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. And I have an old, long-standing belief that in many cases decimal points are just proof that economists do in fact have a sense of humor. That said, models are useful. They can tell you the sign of something, whether a change is positive or negative, order of magnitude, rough percentages. I said earlier that what gets measured gets managed. As reformers, your model points to which reforms we should prioritize now, and which can maybe wait a little bit longer. What do you think are some of the most urgent reforms? Keep in mind that our knowledge is approximately right.
Yeah, I would say from our model, what we're seeing is that regulatory reform is, if you had to pick one thing to do, that's what you would do. And within regulatory reform, the arterial sectors of the economy, in other words, the sort of the things that spread into everything else. So your transportation, energy, all of those types of things. Those are the areas where you need to focus because they have big effects on the rest of the economy. So just doing a few things like that. In the Growth Commission, we've done this sort of process for countries in terms of what their budget should look like. So in the UK, for example, probably the biggest gain you could get in the UK is planning reform, and it's largely planning reform because the Planning Act, the Town and Country Planning Act, which was enacted in like 1945 or something, 47, is so restrictive. So where your regulations, and again, looking across at the stock of regulation and looking at the things that are the most anti-competitive, country by country, the ones that have the biggest negative effects, those are probably where you need to start, prioritizing. The UK, it happens to be energy and planning reform. In other countries, it'll be different things.
You had spoken earlier that tariffs have a surprisingly small effect as ACMDs compared to some of those regulatory measures. Has that changed in the last year of a sea change in trade policy, I think is the polite way to put it?
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, let's say, so tariffs, if you look at the trade pillar, about 40% or so is tariffs. A significant amount is things like trade facilitation and customs processes and border clearances and that sort of thing. So not to be underestimated, but when I say it's smaller than the regulatory competition issues, it's still a big number. It's still 4 to 6% of GDP per capita is a big number. Now, I think when you look at what's happening in the US, there's lots of ways of looking at this. So if you recall what I said about how we got to this point, the collapse of the multilateral discipline on regulatory distortions and so on, we have a world where these anti-competitive market distortions, particularly in the regulatory area, are out of control. It is not wrong to say what we've been doing for the last 30 years has not been working, especially if I'm the US and I am very seriously affected by our failure to deal with these things in China and Japan and Korea and lots of other markets. If the strand, and there are many strands obviously to the Trump policy, if the strand that becomes dominant is the strand that says, I'm going to use the size and attractiveness of the US economy to ratchet down these barriers in other countries and then lock them into zero tariff deals, you can make an argument that could get you to a positive result, a more positive result than we currently have. If the strand that becomes dominant is its tariffs for revenue or tariffs for bringing manufacturing into the US, then that's going to be a negative result for the global economy. I think the challenge we have is that all of these strands are, first of all, they're inconsistent with each other, and secondly, they're in competition with each other. And just to be, a little controversial, as if I haven't been, there are different bits of the administration that believe differently about these strands. It may be the court will make this clearer when the court case comes down, whenever that is. Interestingly, the administration said they want to use these other authorities. All of these other authorities that they would use are based on unfair competition and barriers in other countries. So it moves the debate onto the strand that I think is more useful. But if you're going to do this, if you're going to do this big thing that has potential for catastrophe, I think it's got potential for great results as well. We might disagree about the percentage chance of great results versus the percentage chance of catastrophe, but I think there is a non-zero percentage chance of this being a good outcome. You've got to give very clear signals to countries. You've got to make it very clear to them that there are these distortions that they need to fix, and then they'll get a zero tariff deal. If you start to have very confused signals, then again, if you're an incumbent company, and then when you're negotiating with a country, you're negotiating basically against, particularly on regulatory issues, you're negotiating against its incumbent powers, companies, and you say, okay, we want you to fix this regulatory barrier that has all kinds of negative, damage to us, damage to you, but it benefits this incumbent interest in your country tremendously. We want you to get rid of that. That's really hard for a country to do. You need to have a lot of leverage to make them do that. If you then come along and say, but there's these other things you could do. You could invest in the US, you could create a big fund, and invest in the US. The country's always going to do that. That's the easier thing to do. So the signals have to be really clear, and I'm not sure the signals have been especially clear.
Yeah, there are a few more strands to pull on to reintroduce physics into the discussion. Are tariffs good for revenue? Are they good for national security? Are they intended to get other countries to lower their trade barriers? That's almost an impossibility theorem argument, where you can have one or another of those objectives, but you cannot have them all.
You cannot have all of them. No, absolutely, yeah. It may well be, and I've said this, it's certainly true that if you're looking at the deficit, the trade deficit, which the administration is very focused on.
Sadly, yeah.
It is certainly true that a certain element of the imports coming in from other countries are coming in because of distortions in their markets that are overproducing and so on. And it's certainly true that some of our exports are declining because of distortions and barriers in these countries. So my objective here would be to eliminate the distortions and barriers that cause those problems, and then let the chips fall where they may. I mean, that's how you're going to get GDP per capita growth. That's how you want to maximize these three pillars. If the policy leads to that, great. If the policy leads to something else, not so great.
That is one thing I worry about. It seems as though the administration's policy hinges in part on a belief that two wrongs can make a right. I think we might agree that China is the world's largest source of anti-competitive market distortions. I would love to change that. I think everyone, regardless of politics, is on the same page on that issue. The administration seems to be saying in a lot of ways, in order to beat China, we need to be more like China. That is one risk. Another is incumbent businesses, like you mentioned, using those policy levers not to lower the amount of ACMDs from China and here as well, but for their own short-term gain.
Yeah, to increase them. Yeah.
So how potent are those two factors as obstacles to our overall goal of ACMD reduction around the world?
Very potent. I mean, that's one of the reasons this executive order on anti-competitive regulation in the US is so important, because you can say, that it's not that the US is trying to lower ACMDs around the rest of the world and is going to ratchet up its anti-competitive regulation domestically, because there's an executive order that says we understand that is damaging to our economy and we want to eliminate it. I don't think countries around the world or trading partners use that enough. I mean, I think I've said to countries, you should go in. You've got a vehicle now. Go talk to the DOJ and the FTC about the Jones Act. Go talk to the FTC and the DOJ about, the alcohol distribution system in the US, or whatever it happens to be that is a problem, because you've got a vehicle for doing it. And there are gains, there are big gains for the US for doing it. But there is a big danger. I mean, just let me say something about national security as well, because I think part of the problem with national security and its role in the trade world is that because we don't have good tools in trade and in competition to deal with distortions, we tend to lump everything into national security, because we have a tool in national security that's very effective. So let's just use that. So that tends to be, and that's not, again, it's all about signaling. That's not the right signal. There are no doubt things that are genuine matters of national security that should be dealt with as matters of national security on a necessity basis. But if it's a distortion that's a result of, there's too many, I don't know, just picking a random example, too many pieces of furniture in the US coming from foreign markets because of distortions in foreign markets. Let's deal with the distortions in the foreign markets and not pretend this is a national security issue. that's kind of the problem with the national security approach. But it would be much better if we had trade tools, then the national security levers could be used to do what they're meant to do.
I have one last question for you, and zoom out a bit to the big picture. Reform often requires a perfect storm of the right political leaders, the right reforms, the right ideas, the right political moment. Do you see anything like that happening on the horizon? Is there a modern day Richard Cobden or Cordell Hull or any other real mover of free trade and free competition?
Well, I think, the moment that we're in right now is a potential moment for, to be fair to the administration, there are conversations in other countries that they would never have had absent the tariff tactic, if you want to call it that. Like in the EU, they are talking about some of their environmental regulation, EU deforestation regulation, CBAM, in ways that they never did before, not only because of the US pressure, but also because member states inside the EU are saying this has gone too far and it's damaging to us. So I think now is that moment, actually. There are these unfrozen moments in time, in history that things are up for grabs. We have to be active participants in this process. We should not sit back and put our heads in the sand and say the Trump tariff doctrine's a disaster. Let's wait for it to go away and it'll go back to normal. It's not going to go back to normal. But what we should do is use it to achieve what we think will help the global economy in terms of distortion reduction. If we could get the EU to change some of their regulatory approaches on these things, it would be a huge benefit for the global economy. But there's a corollary to that, which is lock it in with zero tariff deals. We need to get back to zero tariff deals on this, and we need to ultimately multilateralize this whole thing. Ultimately, that's where we want. Before this unfrozen moment freezes over again, we have to have got at least into the level of significant regionalization of this approach. So I would want this ACMD idea, very much in the CPTPP agreement, in some of these other agreements, so that we can then multilateralize this at some point in the future. But these sorts of moments are fraught with risk because there's huge opportunity. Winston Churchill said, we stand at the gates of majestic opportunities or catastrophic failure. I think that's exactly where we stand right now. This could go very, very badly wrong for the global economy, or it could be a really good thing. But we have to be participants in it. I say to corporates, everything that the administration is putting in these trade deals it's doing with these countries are things that you put in the national trade estimate as a corporate. This is your moment to get them fixed. Get them fixed. Don't sit on the sidelines.
Well, with that, we have a few housekeeping notes before we adjourn, but Shanker, this has been a delight.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. The book is available on Amazon, both of them. They are fantastic. I have a couple of upcoming CEI events to plug. Next week on February 24, your friend and ours, Tim Meares, former FTC commissioner, will be part of a webinar about two papers that CEI just published by he and his co-author Bruce Kobayashi today. They came out this morning. So next week, February 24, webinar on that. That'll be about the Robinson-Patman Act and price controls. On February 26, a week from today, we will be having an event on Capitol Hill in the Russell Senate Office building about the Clean Water Act with Senator Shelley Moore Capito. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not plug the upcoming CEI Summit, which this year will be in Asheville, North Carolina at the Biltmore. More information is online at cei.org/events. We would love to see some of you there. And of course, the annual CEI Julian Simon Memorial Dinner, one of our heroes, will be held this year, I believe in September, at the Library of Congress building, which will be just a beautiful setting to honor ideas like individual dignity and human progress that Julian Simon and you and me and all of us at CEI believe in very deeply. So with that, thank you, Shanker. Thank you, all of you, for taking your time to join us today. And let's do it again sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.